As I mentioned at the beginning of our time together, this is Christ the King Sunday across the Christian world, at least for many who observe the Christian worship calendar. Today is the last Sunday of this worship year. The text today that has been chosen as a part of the revised common lectionary reading is from Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 23. It is the episode where Jesus has been crucified, and Luke's version of how that played out. You've heard me say many times that we have four Gospels, but each of them tell their stories in unique and different ways. In the Gospel of Luke today, we're going to see how the author of the third Gospel portrayed Jesus' death and the particular theme that he wanted to emphasize, which is woven throughout his version of it in a way that's considerably different than Mark and Matthew and the Gospel of John recorded. And I want to show you how it's different and why that's important. Again, the verse that is the key verse in the text and in the reading today is from Luke chapter 23, verses 46 and 47. It says, "Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, 'Father, into your hands I commend my spirit.' Having said this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what had taken place," that is, the centurion in charge of his crucifixion, "he praised God and said, 'Certainly this man was innocent.'" I want to talk to you about an innocent man today. On the screen behind me, I think, is going to be some information that I would like to draw to your attention. For quite a few years now, I've followed something called the Innocence Project. How many of you have heard of the Innocence Project? Okay. I want to give you a little bit of background on that effort. There is, from their website page, there's a summary. The Innocence Project, founded in 1992 by Peter Neufeld and Barry Schink at Cardozo School of Law, exonerates the wrongly convicted through DNA testing and reforms the criminal justice system to prevent future injustice. Those are some pictures of people who have been exonerated by this effort. The allowance since 1989 of DNA evidence, not only in criminal proceedings, but also being used to exonerate people who have already been sentenced, quite a few to death row, has been allowed by law to be used in some of these cases. And it has had a significant influence on the way we approach criminal justice. I'm going to give you some statistics. DNA exonerations in the United States. 1989, the first DNA exoneration took place. 367 DNA exonerees to date. 37 states where the exonerations have been won. The average number of years people who were exonerated had already served. This is an average. 14 years. The total number of years served, 5,097.5. That is how long they spent in prison unjustly in our system. 26 and a half years of age is the average age of the time of wrongful conviction. The average age of exoneration was 42.8, almost 43 years. 43 years old. Think about that gap of being wrongly convicted in a prison. 21 or 367 people served, not Tim, but time on death row. 41 of 367 pled guilty to crimes they did not commit. Think about that. Under pressure of our law enforcement system. 69% involved eyewitness misidentification. So-called eyewitnesses witnessed the wrong person committing a crime. There's a lot more information you can find on that website, but here's the demographics of the 367. 225 of the 367, or 61%, are African American. 110 were Caucasian, 28 are Latino or Latina. 2 are 1% Asian American, less than 1% Native American, and less than 1% self-identified other. If you look closely at this, you'll see that people of ethnic and racial minorities are disproportionately represented in this number. But an even greater subcategory is simply people who are poor, whom our justice system often doesn't serve well because of the cost and expense of having to go through the process of of adjudication or through the criminal justice process. It's a problem in our country. I'm thankful that the United States has many protections included in the Constitution to try to help avoid people who are innocent of crimes being wrongly convicted, but there's clearly a lot of work to be done. And groups like the Innocence Project are a part of it. I'd like for you to be informed of how, in spite of our efforts, and as I said, even constitutional protections, innocent people are falsely charged, wrongly convicted, and sentenced, a number of whom to death row, who are later exonerated for their crimes by processes such as DNA. Serious problem. Did this start with us? No. People being wrongly charged with a crime and being convicted and executed have long taken place. The story that we read today is an example of it. Jesus. Of all people, Christians are to be deeply concerned that we have a justice system in our country, in our society, that is deeply, deeply committed to ensuring that we not wrongly convict those who have been charged with a crime. And they receive due process and every opportunity they can have to exonerate themselves if indeed they are innocent. Very important. But what does the gospel story have to say about this? It was one of the chief concerns of the author of the Gospel of Luke to show that Jesus was innocent of the charges brought against him. Jesus was charged, whether you realize it or not, with insurrection, with being a rebel. And I'm going to show you how Luke tried to deal with that today. It was very important to him, and that's why his gospel and the way he tells the crucifixion of Jesus, as well as the trial and death of Jesus, and the way he does is to emphasize and highlight that an innocent man was wrongly convicted and wrongly executed for a crime. Let's look at it together. First of all, let me emphasize something I've already alluded to. The author of the Gospel of Luke almost certainly used the Gospel of Mark as his primary source, but he supplemented it, his Gospel, with a saying source and material unique to himself. This is the best we can tell about our Gospels. Now, when I was growing up, I just thought that the four gospel writers, they just sat down, they thought, I think I'll come up with, I've heard stories about Jesus and I'll write a gospel and I'll convey it to the community that I'm serving in. And to some extent that did happen. But it's almost certainly true that at least Matthew and Luke, the authors of Matthew and Luke's gospel, used Mark, the oldest gospel text that we have written, used it as their primary source, but then supplemented it with perhaps a saying source that may have been ancient sayings that have been written down that were attributed to Jesus. And then they may have used other material in great liberty in crafting the narrative about Jesus that they thought was important to their community. Once they're written down, they're locked in time. And we often read them casually and don't take notice of some of the particular thematic emphases that the particular gospel writers had. I want to show you Luke's today. And I'll tell you why it's important. Let me note there a couple of things there. Mark was most likely the oldest gospel, written around the year 70 of the Common Era. That was the same year that the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. We talked about that last week. Then Matthew's gospel, probably around 80 of the Common Era, about 10 years after Mark. Luke's gospel, probably another 15 years after Mark. And then the Gospel of John, the gospel that was written last, probably somewhere in the area of 90 to 95. You're talking about 40, 45, 50 years we're talking about after the time of the events described there, after Mark's gospel. So what do we have here? We have a developing gospel tradition that offers some differences and unique perspectives, and that's important to note. If you've ever sat down and tried to compare the gospels or read them side by side, you'll notice that there are differences. They even have, they're even when they quote Jesus' words are changed, and sometimes they change in favor of the way that the particular gospel writer wanted to portray Jesus in a given circumstance. But I want to point out how how Luke talks about the arrest, the trial, crucifixion, and death of Jesus. In Luke's narrative, the Jesus arrest, trial, crucifixion, and death, the theme of Jesus' innocence is uniquely prioritized in a way that deviates from Mark and Matthew. Throughout Luke Acts, and you know he tells us, the only gospel writer who wrote 2 books, Luke and Acts, addresses them to the same individual both times, an individual he calls Theophilus, most excellent Theophilus, perhaps a Roman official, maybe his patron, we don't know. The name Theophilus means lover of God. But he writes to them, and he is really concerned about making the case that Jesus and his earliest followers were in no way guilty of insurrection, of rebellion, that they were not a direct threat to Rome. That is a great concern of this author. And if you'll read through Luke Acts with your eyes open and just read through and notice, you'll notice time and again the author of Luke Acts bends over backwards to say, no, Jesus was innocent of those charges, and all of his other followers, even when they got arrested, and happened quite often, even when they got arrested, they were ultimately exonerated of the charges that were made against them. And this is true in Jesus. So the way he tells the story of Jesus' arrest, his trial, his crucifixion, and his death is unique. And let me show you how, a few ways. Number one, only the Gospel of Luke portrays Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, arguing for Jesus' innocence on 3 different occasions. Pilate insists that Jesus has done nothing worthy of death. Luke's Gospel emphasizes that more so than any other Gospel. Now that's interesting. Pilate does not get a lot of good press from that part of the world or that time of the world. But in Luke's Gospel, the author of Luke's Gospel was almost sympathetic to Pilate. Now in the end, Pilate gives in and allows Jesus to be crucified, orders him to be crucified. The Romans had the power to crucify, so they had to get Pilate to sign off on it. But Pilate bent over backwards not to go through with it according to Luke's Gospel. That is not emphasized in any other Gospel. And here's another thing. Only the Gospel of Luke says that Herod Antipas, the king of Galilee, exonerated Jesus of the charges of insurrection. It is only found in Luke's Gospel that Pilate finds out that Jesus is from Galilee, so he sends, it just so happens in Luke's Gospel that Herod Antipas is in town in Jerusalem for the festival, and so he decides, I'm going to send him off to Herod Antipas, so he sends Jesus. Jesus shows up there to Herod Antipas, the king of Galilee, and Herod is happy to see him because he'd been wanting to see him for a long time. At least it's the time he had heard that he was moving about after Herod Antipas had killed John the Baptist for speaking out against his marital history. Herod wants Jesus to perform a miracle, entertain him. Jesus remains silent. They mock Jesus. They make fun of him. But he sends him back to Pilate, bringing no charge against Jesus. Only the Gospel of Luke emphasizes that Herod Antipas exonerated Jesus from any wrongdoing. Only the Gospel of Luke. Number 3, only the Gospel of Luke reports that one of the 2 criminals crucified alongside Jesus on his right and his left declares him to be innocent of the charges brought against him. Now, the criminals are named insurrectionists or rebels in Mark's Gospel, and nothing's really said about an interaction that they had with Jesus. In Matthew's Gospel, they're also called rebels, insurrectionists. By the way, do you know who the 3rd rebel that was supposed to be crucified in Jesus' spot that day was? He's called Barabbas, the son of Abbas. Barabbas' charge, remember what the charge was? Insurrection and murder. He was a terrorist alongside these other 2. Only Luke calls him a criminal, siding with the Roman position. Matthew and Mark says they were insurrectionists, they were rebels. Matthew's Gospel says they both ridicule and mock Jesus. Only Luke says that one of the criminals mocked Jesus and the other one said, "Why are you mocking him? We're guilty of the charges that," now it's an unusual thing for someone to say, "we're guilty of the charges that have been brought against us, but he's innocent of them." Once again, Luke says Jesus is innocent through the mouths of a criminal charged with a crime of insurrection and crucified alongside Jesus, because it's only there that Jesus says the words to that criminal. Remember what it was? He was very gracious. This day you'll be with me in paradise. Only found in the Gospel of Luke. And then there's one other. Only the Gospel of Luke records that the centurion in charge of his crucifixion declared Jesus innocent. Now, in Mark's Gospel and Matthew's Gospel, there is a centurion there, but in both of those Gospels, he makes a theological statement. He says, surely this was the Son of God. Same way in Mark's Gospel and in Matthew's Gospel, Luke changes the words. Says nothing about Jesus being the Son of God, a theological statement. What does he say? Surely this was an innocent man. Do you get the point? Throughout the entire process, Luke wants to make sure everybody who reads his gospel, especially Theophilus and any good Romans, he wants them to know that everybody except for the Jewish leadership, which he accuses here of crucifying Jesus, everyone says that Jesus was innocent. Now, what's the point? Well, the author of Luke's gospel knows that the gospel is now about Jesus is now spread across the Greek and Roman Empire. And the charge that many good Romans would have brought against Christianity that would have caused them to dismiss it in their eyes would simply say, how in the world can we ever follow someone who was crucified by Roman authorities, the Roman governor, for insurrection and rebellion against Rome? We can't be identified with that. Can we? No, Luke says, yes, you can. Because Jesus was innocent of all those charges. And he also goes out of his way to say Jesus and his followers had nothing to do and had no intentions of ever leading an armed revolt against Rome. You can trust him as the Christ because he's not a threat to Rome at all. Well, not directly, at least. So what do we say to all this today? Well, that's the story. It's an interesting story about how the Gospels differ and how Luke had a particular theme that he wanted to emphasize. And indeed, we as followers of Jesus today say Jesus was innocent and he was falsely accused, wrongly tried, wrongly convicted, and wrongly executed for a crime he did not commit. But it leaves me with some thoughts today that I want to leave you with. It is very important that we learn from this lesson. Number one, we should learn the importance of religious liberty for all. Because essentially what Jesus was charged with, at least his most adamant enemies, was a religious difference. It is very important that we always stand up for religious liberty for all people. There have been people, and there are people around the world today who are falsely charged, they're falsely arrested, they're falsely tried, and some of them are killed because they believe religious ideas that the majority disavows. We should stand for religious liberty not just for Christians too, but for all people as a matter of religious conscience. Amen. Another thing we should learn from this story is how easy it is for false narratives and false charges to be brought about people, and for them to be wrongly convicted either in a court of law or in the court of public opinion. We mentioned a good thing about Facebook, but I'll say one thing about social media in general that has been a bad thing about social media, and that is when we hear of a story of someone being charged with something or being accused of something, and you go to watch comment pages or the Twitterverse or wherever you go if you're on social media, what you're going to find there is you're going to find judge, jury, and executioner readily available to tell you what horrible things should be done to this person for crimes that we don't even know if they committed or not. By the way, in this story in Luke's gospel, a mob is a part of it. You remember, it's the mob that screams out, "Crucify him and free Barabbas." The ignorant mob, motivated by religious and political demagogues who had an enemy they wanted to destroy. And they were perfectly willing to whip up a mob to help them get that. Don't follow the mob. As it says in the Scriptures, don't follow a multitude to do evil. We must be very careful when people are charged, when people are accused. They might be guilty, but they might not be. And they deserve due process, not only in our legal systems, but in our own minds. Would you like to be falsely accused of a crime you didn't commit? It's very important that we as Christians who follow Jesus be chiefly concerned not with just venting our own emotions, but yet finding the truth of what has occurred when a crime or an individual has been accused of a crime. Jesus was an innocent man. And I think we need more in our society, a greater commitment in our society to making sure our justice system is the best it can possibly be. That due process is followed. That we do not join the mob in condemning people who have not had their time, their hearing in a court of law or even a fair court of public opinion. And that we, above all people, be committed to justice. Not just for the rich and the powerful, but for the poor and the weak and the marginalized as well. I'll leave you with one thing, too, from this story that we can learn. In spite of the false charge, in spite of the wrong conviction, in spite of the fact that Jesus was dying for a crime he didn't commit, notice something else in the story. Jesus did not lose his gracious spirit. For what did he say? Father, forgive them. They do not know what they're doing. And to a man who had justly been convicted of a crime alongside of him, who recognizes his innocence, Jesus says, today, this day, you will be with me in paradise. For this man on the cross had nothing to offer except his sorrow over his own wrongdoing. And Jesus was more interested in offering him forgiveness and a future than he was in destroying him. May we carry that same spirit with us wherever we go.